Well, hello there. It's a sultry July afternoon, and so I may be fighting off a few bugs and things like that. Um, but it's overcast, so it's a good day for reading another chapter. And we are at chapter 39 of the book of Genesis, which is going to pick back up the famous story of Joseph. Just in case you missed a couple of weeks ago, or you forgot, before I read chapter 39, I want to remind you of what we know about Joseph so far. Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob, and Jacob's other name is Israel. Okay, so God has decided to begin to grow a nation out of one man, Jacob, and so he changes his name to Israel, and so all of Jacob's descendants are going to be known as Israel. And Joseph, when he's born, he has 10 older brothers. Joseph was born in Paddan Aram, generally speaking, in the household of his grandfather, his mother's father, Laban. And then apparently when he was quite young, so maybe who knows how much he remembered of living in Paddan Aram, when he was still quite young, his own father, Jacob, or Israel, took his whole family and left his grandfather's household and came back to the promised land where Jacob had been born, okay, because Laban was Jacob's father-in-law. All right. So I'm not sure how old exactly Joseph was when that happened either, but he was clearly quite young, and so they came back to the promised land. So Joseph is the only child, the only son of the favorite wife of Jacob, right? His 10 older brothers are actually half brothers, and among them, the 11 sons have 4 different mothers, right? And Joseph is the only son of Rachel, who is Jacob's favorite wife. So Joseph has a privileged position in his father's household. Then tragedy strikes. While they're on a trip in the promised land, Joseph's mother, Rachel, dies giving birth to Joseph's younger full brother, Benjamin. So Benjamin never gets to really know his mom. She gives birth to Benjamin and she dies. So I'm sure that was very tough on Joseph. I'm sure he was old enough to, feel the grief of that, of his mother dying. So he had to endure that. Then it looks like his privileged status increased, because that's understandable if you think about it. If you think about one way Jacob would deal with the grief of losing Rachel would be to shower Rachel's 2 sons with even more love and affection, okay, and special attention. And apparently that's what happened, and so you'll remember 2 weeks ago we read that Joseph has been presented a very nice present from his father, which is a coat of many colors, and he's been given the task of errand boy and news gatherer for his father. So he would go out and report on his brothers, and sometimes he would not give a good report about his brothers, his older brothers. So his brothers became quite angry with him. So again, we see after the tragedy of Joseph's mother's death, he does seem to be enjoying being the favorite son, okay? Not the secretly favorite son, the openly favorite son, all right? And then a big tragedy strikes, right? Maybe we shouldn't call that a tragedy because he has a little something to do with it. His brothers can't stand that he keeps giving these bad reports, that he's the favorite, that he has dreams that seems to indicate that they will bow down to him. So on one of his visits to his brothers out in the field, they kidnap their own brother. They take his coat of many colors. They cast him into a pit. They consider killing him. And then they finally decide to sell him into slavery to some of their distant cousins, the Ishmaelites, who are on their way down to Egypt. Okay, so they sell them to They sell Joseph to slave traders. So that would be, if we're graphing the tidings of Joseph's life, that would be a big dip, right? That would be a bad day. Okay. So Joseph is now, and his father thinks that he's dead. Okay. So his father's not going to come looking for him. His father thinks he's dead, and the only people that know he's really alive hate him and are glad to be rid of him. So Joseph has no hope of a rescue party coming to get him. He has been sold into Egypt, a place that he's never been. He's taken hundreds of miles down and then sold in a slave auction in Egypt. And the Egyptians did not consider professional herders to be anything better than low class. All right, so the Egyptians had the most advanced civilization at this time. They were the most powerful empire in the world, and they had a lot of cities. And if you were of Egyptian heritage, ethnically Egyptian, then you probably had a privileged place. Okay, in other words, you would be an overseer, or you would be in religion or in academia, right? You'd be in the schools, or you would have some kind of craft or trade that you would be good at, or you would be a merchant. What you wouldn't do is you wouldn't be herding sheep. The Egyptians would conquer people and use the conquered slaves to do their dirty work. Okay, so Joseph joined that lowest class, right? The class of dirty work. So, but he was bought not by some farm owner who was just going to throw him out into the fields and work him to death. Instead, he was bought by the captain, or a captain, of Pharaoh's guard. Okay, apparently somebody who was really important there in the capital, wherever Pharaoh was. That's where Joseph got to live. So he got to live in a big city, and he became a household servant, like a butler, right? So that was a lot better than a lot of places he could have ended up as a slave in Egypt. Okay, he became a household servant, and if we put together a few clues in the narrative, we can figure out that Joseph ended up being a servant in this guy's household for about 10 years. And now I'm getting into what we're going to read today, but I just want to sort of provide an overview. He's going to stay there about 10 years, and we'll see how that goes for him. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of think about it. I like to think of a graph of Joseph's life. Right, you're born in Paddan Aram. When you're a little baby or a little kid of some age, you go back to the promised land where your dad's from in a big move. Then your mom dies, giving birth to your baby brother. And then when you're at 17, even though your dad's favorite, you're kidnapped and sold into slavery by your brothers, and your dad thinks you're dead. And you're in another country. All right, Joseph didn't speak Egyptian, so during these 10 years, I'm sure he learned to speak Egyptian. I'm sure he came to grips with the fact that he was most likely going to be a slave forever in this guy's house. Okay, that's not rock bottom. All right, so we'll see what rock bottom is in this chapter. But overall, I'd say Joseph's life, if we were looking at it, we would say it's trending downwards. Okay, so I wanted to give you that introduction to be thinking about. Chapter 39 of Genesis. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he, that is Potiphar, made him, Joseph, overseer of his house, and all that he had was put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So, right, when Joseph first arrives at Potiphar's house, I'm sure it was very traumatic. He's realizing this is real, there's no escape, I'm stuck, I'm a slave in a foreign country, and what's going to happen to me? Okay, I want my dad, right? But he's not going to get his dad, at least not yet. And so he begins to grow up. He's 17 when he gets sold into slavery, and he goes ahead and finishes growing up, I guess we can say, in Potiphar's household. But the Lord keeps blessing everything Joseph does. In other words, every time Joseph's given a job, he's able to do it really well, and everything works out well. So much so that his owner recognizes that there seems to be some sort of charm with Joseph, right? And so his owner does something. His owner begins to give Joseph more and more responsibility until finally it says that he left all he had in Joseph's hand. He didn't know what he had except for the bread which he ate. It finally got to the point where this guy just said, Joseph, you run all my fields, my operations, my household, everything I have. This guy was clearly a rich guy. And he put everything under Joseph's control to the extent that he didn't even know what he had anymore. All he knew is what was on the plate in front of him, okay? He trusted Joseph with everything that he had, and continued to prosper because of this. So, that's about as sweet a deal as you can get if you're a slave, right? I mean, that's about as good as you could ask for if you're a slave, is to be basically you're in charge of a big rich operation, a big rich estate, I guess we should say, down in Egypt, the most powerful country. Okay, only your owner is above you, and he trusts you with everything. So that's an upturn, right, on our graph. Pretty big upturn too. However, verse 7, it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now that's interesting. He says, how can I do this, which would be sinning against God, right? So Joseph says, right, his wife, Potiphar's wife, wants to have an affair with Joseph, okay? And Joseph says no, and he says, you're the only thing that my master has reserved for himself. Rightfully so, you're his wife, okay? So this would be a huge betrayal of my master, and more importantly, Joseph, I think, recognizes here that his success is because God is with him, and he's not going to sin against God, right? It would be an even bigger betrayal of God. So, verse 10, so it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her, to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time, when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand, and fled and ran outside. So he didn't have a t-shirt like this, right? They would have those, you've seen the pictures, I think, in your mind of people living really long ago. They would usually have this sort of wraparound tunic. It might have a button or a clasp or something, but it might just have a sash, kind of like a belt or something that loosely holds it on. Egypt's a hot country today, and it was a hot country back then, so they wore loose-fitting clothing, light-colored. And it was probably kind of like a bathrobe almost, except lighter, and probably just held on with a sash. I'm just guessing. But in other words, it was easy for her to grab onto part of it, and he's going to get away from her. And so he just kind of spins out of it and leaves his tunic in her hand, right? And runs away. Verse 13, and so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she got an idea, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he, that is my husband, he has brought to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me. So it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside. So she concocts a story. There's no witnesses, right? She waited until the house was empty except her and Joseph. And then this incident happens. She's got Joseph's shirt in her hand, and she says, oh no, he's running away. What if he goes and tells what I've done to my husband, right? I'll beat him to the punch. I'm going to say it's his fault before he can say anything. So she quickly calls all the other servants and said, look, he tried to get me, all right? So don't leave me alone anymore. I've got his shirt as proof. He tried to attack me. And then sure enough, when her husband gets home, she repeats the story. And does her husband believe her? Well, verse 19. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. So yes, he did believe her. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. That's verse 20. We have a few more verses. But I think I'm going to call this talk, Joseph Hits Rock Bottom. And I think if we're graphing Joseph's life, it happens at the end of verse 20, where it just says, and he was there in the prison. So, what do you think was going through Joseph's mind, right? As he's in Potiphar's house and he finally gets used to it, he finally gets used to being a slave, right? Because he's there, like I said, for about 10 years before this incident happens. And he begins to increase in favor, okay? Until finally, I mean, if you're the head of Potiphar's house, you have a very cushy life. You have a much better quality of life than he ever had, even as the favorite son back with Jacob, okay? And Joseph may have been thinking, wow, God brought me down here to give me this good life down here in Egypt. This isn't so bad, you know. I don't know if he was thinking about getting married at some time, but probably he could have if his master trusted him that much. That wouldn't have been a problem, I don't think. And but anyway, he had a very fulfilling life, I think you could say. He had all kinds of resources and options and control of things. He was still a slave, but Joseph being over Potiphar's household was probably most of the free Egyptians would have traded places with Joseph, to tell you the truth. And then one day, this incident happens, and his master believes him. And so now Joseph is thrown into the king's dungeon, right? And that's not where you want to be, okay? You might say, oh, I would rather be in the king's dungeon's probably nicer than the other dungeons. No, I don't think so, okay? That's not how it worked back then. If you were an enemy of the king, then there was a special dungeon reserved for you, right? And Potiphar was sort of in charge of some part of the military there, Pharaoh's guard, so he had access. So Joseph didn't get put in the county jail. He got thrown in the imperial dungeon, the place reserved for the worst of the worst, okay, unless they were going to be killed. And the charge that gets him there is the ultimate betrayal of this high-ranking Egyptian. In other words, Joseph is now in a much worse position than he was when he first got to Egypt, okay? Because his master has trusted him with more and more and more and more and more. When his master heard his wife's story and believed her, think how he must have felt. I've given everything to this guy. I've put in everything under his control. I don't even know what I have anymore, what I own. I've trusted him so much. And apparently that wasn't enough. He wanted my wife too. So it's remarkable that Joseph wasn't put to death. Of course, God was with him. That wasn't God's plan. But he was put in the worst dungeon available. And it simply says, and he was there in the dungeon. Okay, there's no appeal. There's nobody going to come and say, hey, look, you got this all wrong. There's no chance of it being overturned. There's no chance of escape. Right? So now Joseph isn't thinking, I got to get used to life as a slave. I've now lost a really nice position through no fault of my own. The man who trusted me now thinks that I'm the worst scum of the earth. And I'm now got to get used to the prospect of spending out whatever days God gives me left in this horrible dungeon. Right? Think about that day, the day Joseph is delivered into the dungeon for this crime, which he did not commit. That had to have been rock bottom. It just had to have been. Okay? I think. I can't imagine being in a prison. That would be really tough for me. You know, I love to be able to a certain extent, drop what I'm doing and go do something if I want to go do it. Okay? And to be in a prison where you have no choices, right? No freedom. That would be rough, and no hope, right? Well, humanly speaking, you would have no hope. Okay, perhaps Joseph did have hope. I don't know. But as far as graphing his life, that would have been I think that's when we would say Joseph hit rock bottom. Maybe not. Maybe the sting of being betrayed by his own brothers was worse. I don't know, but it would have seemed like to me, right? Like, okay, God brought me down here and it was horrible, but now things are going really well. I'm 10 years in. I've got a future. I've got prospects, and then suddenly, bam! Now you're in the dungeon. That's verse 20. Look at what the words are in verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. Remember, mercy means you don't get what you're deserved. What you deserve. You don't get what you deserve. That's what mercy means. Technically, right? We use the word grace to mean you get something good that you don't deserve. I think we talked about this before. But mercy means you don't get something that you do deserve. So it's interesting that this verse doesn't say God showed him grace. It says he showed him mercy. In other words, Joseph is not going to get what he deserves. That's what mercy is. You might say, wait a minute. How does Joseph deserve this? Well, Joseph's a sinner. We all are sinners. Okay? And what we all deserve is death. We can't say, God, you owe me 70 years on this earth. As soon as you commit your first sin, when you're a little child, you deserve death. And it's only God's mercy that it doesn't happen right then and that we're cast into hell. Okay? We get a chance to find out about Jesus and what he's done for us. We get a chance to do some good works if that's what God has in store for us in this world. So, it may seem strange to say God showed him mercy. In other words, he's not getting what he deserved, but in the grand scheme of things, Joseph deserves to be cast into prison. Okay? He deserves everything he gets that's bad because he is a sinner, just like everyone is. Okay? All of Adam's race is sinner. So, but God was with Joseph, and God showed him mercy. And, in verse 21, he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing, Joseph's doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. The exact same thing starts to happen now with the keeper of the prison. Is Joseph at some point gets a tiny little task and everything Joseph puts his hand to turns into an awesome success. And the keeper of the prison begins to notice a pattern and begins to give Joseph more and more responsibilities until finally Joseph is running the prison, just like he was running Potiphar's household. Okay. So immediately, okay, when Joseph hits rock bottom, at least from my perspective, God starts him back up again. Okay. The same sorts of things are happening. And we'll find that's the end of the chapter, by the way. Okay, so we'll find out where this goes. Joseph's going to spend 2 years in prison. Okay, but it's an upward trend. Okay, so Joseph's life has been marked with these upward trends, and then punctuated by tragedies. Okay, he's his father's favorite son. His mother dies. Okay, he gets a coat of many colors. His brothers sell him into slavery. He's given charge of Potiphar's household. He is falsely accused of attempted adultery with Potiphar's wife, thrown into prison. And now he's earning the favor of the prison keeper. Okay? So, it's an interesting roller coaster ride, right? We've just now finished reading it, so I guess I should pray, even though I've been talking my way through it. Let me do that real quick, and then I'll give you some concluding thoughts. How about that? Lord, we do thank you for this story of Joseph, and I do pray that these thoughts that have come into my head as I've read it would be in accord with your will for those who hear. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So this makes you think, because I think there's a big temptation. Now you, if you're a youth and listening to this, which is what this was technically intended for, but if you're not a youth, it's just fine if you're listening. But if you're a youth, then you don't have a whole lot of graph, right? Your life, you may think you have some big ups and downs, but trust me, there's more, okay? You probably don't have a lot of reference points. And if you're older, you probably do, okay? You probably have some big points in your life, big high points and horrible low points. Okay, the longer you live, you're going to collect those sort of things. I think there's a big temptation to assume God's curse on us, or God's disfavor, or God's wrath every time something bad happens. And conversely, I think there's a temptation that when things are going smoothly, that God must be happy with everything we're doing. Okay? And that's not how the Bible tells us to evaluate our lives. The Bible does say there's a relationship between the state of blessedness of your life and your obedience, but it doesn't say that we're to evaluate our choices and our lifestyle just based on whether it's working or not, right? And I think this chapter is a good example of that. Okay, so we have Joseph seemingly being very faithful. He certainly expressed faith in God when Potiphar's wife invited him to take part in this affair, and he said, "No, I'm not going to do it. It would. How could I betray God?" Right. So Joseph's being faithful, and then this happens to him, and he's cast into prison. He hits what I would say is rock bottom. So it would be tempting for Joseph to say, "God, what was going on? I thought we had something. I thought you delivered me from this life of toil and bondage by giving me this exalted position, and now I'm worse off than I've ever been. I'm in the dungeon," right? But possibly, certainly by the end of Joseph's life, or by the next few chapters, Joseph has a very mature understanding of what God's doing in his life. Okay, so I don't know if he does now or not, but what God is doing, spoiler alert, is God is using Joseph to begin to accomplish the promises that he gave to Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham. Okay, remember when Abraham fell asleep and the smoking oven and the flaming torch passed between the pieces, and God said, "Know for certain that your descendants will go to a country that is not theirs, and they will be servants there for 400 years, and afterwards I will bring them out a nation into the promised land. Okay? God has decided that the time is right to begin that process. Okay? And so God moves Joseph from Canaan down to Egypt. Step one. Okay? And then, when the time is right, he's going to move Joseph into the king's dungeon. That's important. If Joseph had been put in any other dungeon, what's going to happen next week couldn't have happened. Okay? Right? And we'll see. Joseph's on the way up now. Okay? And it's a meteoric rise. But every step of the way, God's doing this intentionally. It's his plan, and it's going to end with Joseph being in a place that he never could have dreamed. No one could have dreamed. You and I couldn't have made this up, this story, how this story ends, okay? Joseph's going to end up in a place, in a position that is far above anything he could have imagined, okay? But he has to go through these tragedy days to get there. Okay, there's really no other way, or I'm sure there's other ways, but this is how God chose to do it. And I think Joseph may, I hope he does at this point, be beginning to understand this, okay, and trust God. How easy is it for us to understand this, though, right? Let me put it in perspective. And I guess if you're a youth, the best example I could be is you go to a school, or maybe you're homeschooled, and things seem to be going well, and then your parents move, right? And you have to make all new friends. There's a day of, from your perspective, sort of a tragedy, okay? And you have to start all over. And it's not as good as it was, and you miss your old friends, and there's new friends that are fine, but they don't understand you, okay? Well, adults have things like that too, right? What if you're at a job for a while? What if you're at a job for 10 years, okay? And you're doing really well, and then one day something happens. Let's say it's not even your fault, and you get blamed for something, and you're fired, okay? And then that causes you to have to move, right? That could happen. That happens to people a lot, okay? And you think, God, what did I do? How did I displease you? How did I anger you? Well, you don't need to be second-guessing yourself when these sorts of things happen in your life. If you sin, if you do things God tells you not to do, then he's not pleased with you. If you obey, then he's pleased with you. All right? Whether or not inconvenient or troubling or distressing events happen in your life are not necessarily a reflection of whether God's pleased or displeased with you. Okay? Sometimes God has great things in store for us and moves us to other places so that we can achieve those great things for his glory. And it's painful to us when he moves us, all right? Okay, and it doesn't have to be a physical move. It can be all kinds of things. Maybe you're really good at something. Maybe you're the world's greatest video game player, and then you go blind, right? That would be kind of a dumb example, but, right? And then you're like, now what do I do? Okay, well, you start over. You're not dead, so you keep being obedient, and you do what God has for you next. That's what you do. Right, Joseph's life is an incredible example of this. I mean, you couldn't... it probably wouldn't be made into a movie because people would say it's too unbelievable what happens, and yet this is true. So, but this can happen to us all the time on a small scale or on a large scale, okay? So, what does that mean? It means if you're sinning and everything's great, you need to stop, okay? And it means if you're being obedient and your world seems to be falling apart, you need to keep being obedient, okay? The main thing is God is in control of the lives of those whom he loves and who have put their faith in him, and he is going to use them to accomplish his good purposes, okay? So hopefully this chapter in the life of Joseph hits rock bottom. Well, he did hit rock bottom, but if you know the end of the story, okay, maybe you do, maybe you don't. So if you know the end of the story, you'll realize that these are prerequisites to a glorious ending here. Okay, Joseph going to Egypt and then going to the king's dungeon. And if you already know the story, then you're kind of excited to read these things. You're like, hey, God's moving Joseph along in his plan, and he's that much closer to that awesome spot that he has planned for him. Okay, so it's hard to do that when we don't already know the specifics of our own story. Okay, and I'm not saying if you're a Christian you're going to end up being the president or a millionaire or anything like that, but God had a plan for Joseph. And that's all any of us can hope to achieve, is to accomplish what God intends for our lives to accomplish for his kingdom. Right? Right. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's all I'll say about that. So next time, we'll see what happens with Joseph in the dungeon. He's already on his way up again because now he's basically running the dungeon. So we'll see what happens next. See you then. God bless you. Bye-bye.